2 projects, 10 projects, 30 projects, 70 projects, 100 projects. That's a business.
You are listening to the Property Developer Podcast, your home for tips, ideas and inspiration to help take your developing to the next level. Now here's your host, Justin Getty.
Hello and welcome to episode 78 of the show. Thanks for joining me. How are you doing? Projects all on track? I'm doing well. Getting off to a busy start to the year. Feels like this year is going to be particularly active with lots going on, so I'm really looking forward to it. Got a lot of things planned for the year and I can't wait for them to start happening. What about you? What have you got planned for the year ahead? Lots of big ideas and big plans? I hope you get into it and start delivering and achieving everything you want this year. Got another great episode coming up for you today. We have our follow-up conversation with Rod Fehring. So I had a chat with Rod 2 episodes ago, and I enjoyed our conversation so much that I asked him for a follow-up chat, which he kindly agreed to, and that's what we're going to hear today. So we go even deeper into his career and the lessons that he learned. Before we get to that, here's a quick update on my projects. So my site that's under construction, things are just getting back underway after the summer break. There's a lot going on. We're well into the framing stage now. We're even doing some of the upper levels on some of the townhouses, which is great. Got some of the glazing that's gone in, and I'm looking forward to that one coming to completion this year. We've also made a couple more sales in the last few weeks, which is nice. That takes us to about 75% sold, which is pretty good considering we're only about halfway through or just over halfway through the build. So I'm pretty happy with how that's going and I hope that continues. On my other project, I've been going through the tender assessment from the builders that have submitted quotes for my next project. And I'm just been in discussions with them around value management options, way that we can save money. And I'll pretty shortly be making a decision about which builder to appoint and starting the next phase of discussions with them and also launching a sales and marketing campaign to get a couple of those units sold so that we can get our construction funding sorted out. So lots going on that front as well. So pretty busy start to the year for me. I'm pretty excited about it all. I'm also excited about the work that I've been doing on my new training program, which is coming together quite nicely. Don't forget, if you are interested in finding out how ready you might be to become a property developer, head over to propertydevelopertraining.com and take the quick audit or assessment tool that I've posted there for you and find out how ready you might be to get started in property development. We've also got the mentoring program that's available to help you get started. So if you would like to find out more about that, you can email me, justin@propertydeveloperpodcast.com, and I can send you some further information about that. And if listening to me on the podcast is not enough and you want more from me or more from the show, don't forget you can catch me on all the various socials. We're on LinkedIn, Insta and Facebook mainly, under the handle of Property Developer Podcast. So if you want to see how my projects are progressing, I do post regular video updates from the site, along with other news and tidbits and things that I think you might be interested in. So be sure to check those out. And one final request from me, if you are enjoying the show and you can find the time to leave a review on iTunes or any other review sites, I would be most grateful to you. Alright, on to today's show with part 2 of my discussion with Rod Fehring. As I mentioned, if you didn't catch the first part of the discussion, which was episode 76, go back and have a listen to that, because we cover a lot of Rod's career and how he went from a humble public servant to the head of one of Australia's largest public property development companies, Fraser's Property, before he retired in 2020. That was a fantastic conversation that I enjoyed so much, and we didn't actually get through a lot of the questions that I really wanted to ask Rod. So I asked if he'd have another chat with me, and he kindly agreed to that, which is what we're going to have today. So in the follow-up conversation, we cover the memorable projects that Rod considers as he looks back over his career, more of the lessons learned from those projects and more broadly from his career. we talk about social housing and the future of Australia's residential housing markets. So another great, deep conversation coming up that I'm sure you'll learn a lot from. So stick around as we talk to Rod Fehring. And I wasn't sure how to kick off my conversation with Rod, given I haven't had a follow-up chat with anybody before. So I thought I would start off by asking Rod what food he wouldn't eat until he was sick.
Tuna mornay. My mum used to make the most appalling tuna mornay. She was a brilliant cook, but when it came to seafood, she had no idea. She was brought up in the bush, so she, we lived on, fish and chips for us was frozen fish. If you had fresh fish, you wondered why it fell apart. And so she wasn't good on anything seafood, but she was brilliant on typical Country Women's Association cookbook, author and contributor as well as a recipient and practitioner. She was brilliant at anything sweet, cakes, slices, anything like that. She was a brilliant cook of red meat and any form of meat. She was fantastic, and she did some really exotic dishes like curried chicken. I mean, that was really exotic for us. We thought that was, Oriental. And a big effort. But, my brother had always, through every birthday, we'd get to select what we wanted to eat. And my brother would always have curried chicken and rice. And it's fantastic, I have to say. I really enjoyed it. But
With raisins?
No, definitely not. No, that was getting too exotic. The idea of doing anything other than by the recipe when you were actually out of your comfort zone. She was very creative when it came to meat of any type, but when you're doing sort of dishes with a lot of condiments, she stuck to the recipe. Anyway, so we're diverting already.
Yeah, I can remember my mum making curries when I was a kid, and they always had raisins in them. And back then, you were like, "Oh, pick the raisins out."
I think you tried that a few times, and we just said, "Oh no, this is no good. Just get rid of them."
What was your mum's one of her good desserts or sweets that she would bake?
Oh, you name it. Syrup dumplings. She made her own ice cream. What else was there? Trifle. She was pretty good trifle, as long as the cream and custard was sort of literally overflowing everything. So not low fat wasn't something that was understood in farmers too, and particularly with the dairy farm component. There was plenty of milk and butter.
Yeah. Yeah, everything tastes good when you got butter, cream, sugar.
Yeah. Trouble is, anyway, move on. My dad died at 52 of a heart attack, so go figure.
But probably enjoyed his food along the way.
He did, yeah.
All right, well, I thought we might pick up our conversation almost where we left off last time, which was an area I was quite keen to explore, but we just ran out of time. When I asked you to choose your favourite project, you said you couldn't really pick a favourite, that you were more pleased, or you looked upon and reflected about a body of work that you had contributed to or been involved with. I was keen to get your thoughts on that body of work. Which projects stand out for you, and what is it about them that make them stand out?
Okay. Why I referred to a body of work was because I've moved. I mean, it's not as though I stayed with one. It started with an organisation when I was 20 and then stayed there until I was, 60 something. I moved roughly every 5 years, and to be honest, if I reflect on that decision to move it wasn't by design, but I had a sort of a sense that in any role you take on, you've really got to make I'm sort of an off and on person. I'm not really halfway. And so if you're into it and you get into it, that has a sort of a use by date. And I became conscious of the fact that you really have an obligation to be as good as you can be and help and make other people be as good as they can be in a space of time. And that can't be perpetuated forever. And so the idea of sorting businesses, sorting projects, getting them up and operating, getting them functioning, getting them positioned well, getting the dynamics of the project right, from a cost and a revenue and a marketing and from sales and from the people, from your consultant team or your in-house team, all that stuff, getting all that aligned so that you've got a clear objective as to what success looks like, and then making it happen. And then you do that for a period of time, and it's really, really rewarding. And then there comes a time when the choice is to stay and keep maintaining, or move and do it again. You can do that with projects within that sort of 5-year lifespan, generally speaking, but progressively larger projects, 5 years is not long enough. And a lot of the things that I've sort of ended up doing that are a feature of what I've done over a career have been large-scale, long-term, complex projects. And what I've found is that if some of them, the longest I think is 24 years. I've had intermittent involvement over that period of time for reasons I couldn't have sort of anticipated. But because the Australian property industry is a relatively small one, and if you do move, you end up getting recycled around. So you find yourself bumping into the same projects if they're long term. So you can't really then take a view that, I'll stay on that project and start to finish and finish it. Well, I couldn't anyway. Some people do and love that, and then look for the business to, what's the next thing after that? And that sort of led me to relatively quickly into roles where I was managing and responsible for multiple projects and multiple project teams. And then that you migrate into a situation where it's not just multiple projects and multiple projects teams, but it's the business of enabling those multiple projects and project teams. And so that's the progression of the career. So I have these discussions with people saying, look, the project is king. Yes, of course it is, but you've got to recognise that a project lives in an ecosystem within a business, and it either gets enriched by that ecosystem or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you find that the project teams revert on themselves. And regard anything outside as being interfering, or all those sorts of things. Not connected to the real world. What are the other sort of comments that you get? Blah blah blah. And from my point of view, that's okay, because that's passion in terms of people buying into the project that they're on. But you've got to also be able to multiply that into multiple projects, 2 projects, 10 projects, 30 projects, 70 projects, 100 projects. That's a business. And a business that's able to diversify itself that way and be able to create a culture and an environment that values the contribution and respects the importance of the individual project, but then creates, if you like, a constant tension to cause project teams, people within project teams, to constantly be challenged by and encouraged to be better, encouraged to think beyond what we've always done to what could be done, to think beyond, this is the market we serve, to, what other markets are possible, to think beyond, the pricing is what it is. Well, no, you can create niches and actually create premiums. To think about, how assets are created and then sustained by good asset management, all that stuff. No one's the repository of all information when it comes to that. And then when you look at the span of time over which I've been doing this sort of stuff, technology's changed so remarkably. So a lot of things can be automated that you are otherwise employing 3 people to do. That doesn't mean to say you sack the 3 people. You just find how those people then can be redeployed so that they can do and manage 3 times more than what would otherwise be the case, and use your technology to actually enable that to be possible. So that's what I mean when I say a body of work, because I've sort of migrated through from an individual project, which was the best of all possible jobs, because the world's quite finite then, and you sort of feel that you're in control of all of the moving parts. But then, and if you're lucky enough to deliver really well on a project, then you find what happens is that, oh well, here's another 3. But then as soon as you go beyond 1, 3, well, they're all different dynamics, and trying to employ the same principles that you applied on project X to project W, Y, and Z, because they're different projects, you can find yourself in difficulties, because the markets are far more discerning and bespoke than generic. Yes, there are generic elements to what you do. Oh, we're going to do housing, or we're going to do office, or we're going to do retail. Well, they're just labels. What do you mean? And there's so much more that sits inside the idea of how retail complements residential, how residential and retail by themselves create a precinct, but then can be complemented by office, how those 2 things, or those 3 things, then can be complemented by the services that people bring in an environment where they want to experience something different. So design and place and architecture, all that sort of stuff rolls into the whole alchemy of creating a project that really does find a place in the minds of people, or your marketplace, if you like. And that becomes, if you like, the glue, or the attractor that causes people to choose this location over that location, and give a value to that location that you're attracting them to, and that's sustainable. The beauty of all of that is you can't copy it, and if you've got a good understanding of that, then that's what I mean by an ecosystem. It's a cultural attribute. It's a combination of and synthesis of lots and lots of inputs, from be they architecture, engineering, project management, design, placemaking, commercial principles, leasing, construction, etc., all of those things melded into one overall culture. And if you get that right, you can't just sort of say, oh, well, we'll go and employ that person and bring them into this company and then we'll have it all. Because that person then taken out of an environment that is actually conducive to consistently creating good quality, value for money, inspirational projects, year on year, project by project, decade by decade, that doesn't live with one person. It's like a frog. You take them out of water, they're all right, but they do need to get back in the water eventually, otherwise they dehydrate and die. That's why I talk about a body of work rather than an individual project, just because of the evolution over a period of time.
That's okay. I appreciate the answer, but I'm going to keep probing for some particular projects. I'm sure there's some that do stand out for you. Let me rephrase it. I love the answer. I get exactly what you're saying. I'm certain there must be projects where you look back and you go, gee, that was a fantastic project, whatever it was, waterfront place, this, that, the other, for this particular reason. There must be a couple of those that spring to your mind where you go, that was just a crap piece of land. We added significant value.
I'll give you 4 or 5. There'll be different types of things, though, because what you think of a project and how I think of a project may be 2 different things. The the very first project that that really taught me a lot was the redevelopment of the South Bank of Melbourne, between Power Street and Queensbridge Street and Princess Bridge. Well, not Princess Bridge. What's the one that goes over Flinders Street? That's from the Arts Centre to Flinders Street Station. What's the name of that bridge?
Not being a long-time Victorian, you're going to catch me out here. I know exactly which bridge you mean.
Yeah. What's the name of the bridge? Anyway, that while you find that that section, because what it was back in the early 80s was the Allen's Sweets Factory, 3 old warehouses, one which was the government printing works, and bunch of trees and a sort of a road that connected under that bridge to the gardens. And people would occasionally run along there, but it was mostly just trees tumbling into the Yarra. Exotic species, basically just weeds that grew there. And this is the waterfront image from the CBD of Melbourne, looking towards the water of Port Phillip Bay if you're in a high rise. And that was the glorious Yarra River aspect to the CBD. Not quite the sort of image for a progressive city. And this was at a time when all cities around the world were initiating waterfront redevelopment schemes. Now, Melbourne only has, it sort of has a waterfront, but most of that's taken up by its docks. So really the Yarra River was it, Brown, all that sort of stuff. So what happened was that Evan Walker was the Minister for Planning at the time. I was a project manager, responsible for area improvement. That was what it was called. And David Yenkin was the director. The two of David Yenkin and this was in that period just when John Cain had come to become the Premier. Can't remember, I think he replaced Dick Hayner. And Melbourne was sort of in the middle of a it was the rust bucket. It was of Australia. It was 1983. It was recession, really tough recession, that one too, deep. We hadn't deregulated the dollar or floated the dollar. Lending conditions were all regulated, etc. Very, very, very different world to what we live in now. So Melbourne was a difficult place to be. So the idea was, well, how are we going to revitalise Melbourne? So the first thing is turn the city back on the water, bring the water into the city, give it an aspect, make it integrated into the city. So the job that we had was to, in that section of town, was to, Allens were relocating their manufacturing facilities. Perversely, my very, very, very first job was in the city of Maryborough in central Victoria, who attracted Allens to the city of Maryborough for the location of their Lifesavers and Jubes manufacturing facility. Another one went over to Broadford, which was their Minties and other types of hard candies. Anyway, that's an aside, but there's a funny thing through my career. These little connections just keep popping up. And you say, well, what's going on there? Did I know that? Or was that I had everything? No, it's just coincidental. So then Allens relocated. Then we acquired all of the other and relocated the printing works. We relocated, what was it? The Rubber Dub car wash, all sorts of funny old things that were down there. Raised replanned the area, reconsolidated all of the properties that were on leasehold land, so consolidated the titles, constructed the boulevard that connected Queensbridge to St Kilda Road. That subsequently got reconfigured when the Crown Casino was built. and the creation of Power Street created that linkage with under there. So you then had a plate, if you like, of vacant land opposite the city, construct the boulevard along or South Bank Walk, which was the trees, the bridge with the arch. That was one of mine. We had to float that piece of steel from Western Port Bay up the river in the night to get it there, lay it flat so I could get under bridges and all sorts of things. Anyway, so the pedestrian bridge, disconnected the Sandridge rail bridge and turned that into a pedestrian walkway, which was a huge set of issues because it was growing weeds at the time. Then in each of those parcels, then invite proposals from the private sector to buy them. Turn them freehold, but in response to a scheme. And so that gave rise to Southgate, which Jennings built and lost a lot of money on, but the legacy is still there, and it's been, I think the third or fourth owner has probably done okay. Then Costain built some pretty ordinary buildings, which have subsequently been pulled down and reconstructed. That whole area just transformed. And when you look at it now, it's one of the vibrant hearts of Melbourne. That was the idea. I learned an enormous about the combination of planning, in combination with strategic asset management, in combination with reconstruction of property titles, and then engaging with the private sector to do something that was greater than the sum of the parts, and create a legacy. So I'm very, very. I learned an enormous amount, and I'm just proud that I had something to do with it. The second project then, moving on from that, would be the redevelopment of the old Williamstown rifle range. That was 111 hectares of basically grassland with some rifle butts at the end of it, being used continuously for the training of soldiers before they went off to World War One, the Boer War, believe it or not, in the late 1890s. World War II, and surprise, surprise, when you shoot at something for 135 years, it's got lead in it. And there were 6 butts that were there, with the whole target apparatus and all that sort of stuff. I became project director for that project after a scheme had been put up which was going to demolish all of that, excavate it, create a marina, and all sorts of things, which caused a huge public outcry because and it just so happened to then be in Joan Kirner's electorate. So that got quashed, and I was brought in. Here you are, do this project, which was controversial. Everyone wanted nothing to happen there. The residents, least of all, wanted that dirty word development to occur. So I was given that job, and we had to remediate the project, decontaminate it with lead and antimony, pull all the butts down because they were contaminated, because that was leaching into the pristine white mangrove jawbone area on the peninsula there. But when people learned that it was actually getting poisoned by the butts, then they sort of thought, oh, okay, well, we need to do something here. And, work your way through those issues, then doing all of this at a time when environmental sensitivity was rife, then put a housing development together, then refurbish the old heritage buildings on it, and do it in a way that got market acceptance, and all the way through, surprise, surprise, we're back in the recession again of 1990, the last recession Australia's had until this one. We created record pricing, 100% clearance, release by release, about 1,000 dwellings, 1,035 dwellings all up, and it was and managed all of the environmental issues. There's a brackish lake system there, which complements the food source for the migratory birds, which are all subject to Ramsar conditions, blah, blah, blah. I'm proud of that because of the complexity around it. You had everything, politics, you had local objection, like thousands of them. We got the final approval, actually had 3 objections, 2 of which didn't turn up to the AAT hearing. Still cost us $1.5 million in those days to actually proceed, go through the process. And one said we sold the land after having paid for it 5 years ago. Anyway, that's an aside. But got through all of that. So I'm proud of that one, and it sustained its value, etc. The next one I'd refer to, I think, would be, it's not really, well, there are two of them. One is how working with Rob McClellan. Now, this was in the mid-1990s. There was a car park that sat between St Paul's Cathedral and Peter MacCallum Hospital and the East Melbourne Terrace. And that's my PA. I'll just send her a message.
Okay.
Those notifications aren't turning off very well, are they? What I did there with Rob McClellan was put together a scheme, a planning scheme amendment that enabled 5 things to happen. Firstly, the St Paul's Cathedral had a lien over the vacant space, the air rights. So we had to negotiate a solution with the Archdiocese, which was fun, with John Ralph, who was the chairman of BHP, and the Archbishop, and I was the person who was charged with the responsibility for reading. Then we had to demolish Weary Dunlop. Remember Weary Dunlop, the surgeon? A building named after him and where his office was located on the East Melbourne Terrace. We had to demolish that because it had been vacated. It was one of the very ugly building, unfortunately. So we had to demolish that and get the approvals to do that, while also getting the approvals to refurbish the remaining terraces. Then we had to negotiate a solution for Peter Mac, because this site would abut Peter MacCallum Hospital, and we came up with a solution for them to accommodate the palliative care unit within a part of the redevelopment scheme. And then we ran a tender process after having resolved all of the air rights, reciprocal arrangements around the property, and then invited proposals, which ultimately ended up in the construction of the Park Hyatt Hotel. You won't notice, but the Park Hyatt Hotel is quite happily with the Archdiocese on one side, and Peter MacCallum's palliative care facility, which is all part of the development and performs a wonderful function for people going through the worst part of their life. And all of the other conservation elements were conserved as part of the overall delivery. And I was proud of the site preparation work there in enabling that to be done cost neutral to the government, because otherwise it was just a debacle. Next one.
I actually worked across the road from that exact site for about 5 or 6 years, Rod.
Oh,
it's still integrates quite well into the area.
Yeah, it's settled in, and it's a nice part of town. It always was, but certainly enhanced rather than detracted. Next one, ironically, again, here's another irony. The working again in government was with the consolidation of what is now Freshwater Place. Who developed Freshwater Place? Australand. And we sold it 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, our last interest in that project. What it was the International Mail Centre. BMW had bought the old rubber-dub car wash site. It was contaminated. They didn't know that when they bought it. They wanted to relocate onto the corner, which is where the BMW dealership is now, ironically now subject to a high-rise apartment development. So they'll be moving that out. And then there was Australia Post's International Mail Centre, and then there was the pub. I can't remember the name of the pub. What we did was that then, again, with no money involved, put together a planning instrument that facilitated a land exchange with land that the government owned on the corner which is what BMW wanted, with the land that they had, with a cost adjustment there because there was contamination on the site that they were giving up, and that was compensated for by an adjustment to the height restriction that was on it, and enabling an access road to be constructed in a reserve that was a government road. Then that enabled Australia Post to consolidate a much larger parcel, which was then had access on three sides. And having consolidated that, then we took that to the market with which Australand ultimately ended up acquiring and creating Freshwater Place, which was the office towers and what have you. And in the interim, the pub, we got relocated. The Skipping Girl the VUB neon sign, which was in Richmond. We relocated it there and sold the management rights or the leasing rights for that location, for that sign, for enough to effectively pay for the roads and the other infrastructure that was needed to consolidate. So again, then yes, Australia Post were a beneficiary as a result of the consolidated entity. The uplift that was created by virtue of the planning instrument was then used to acquire the Bendigo Post Office and another two buildings in regional Victoria, which the government wanted, and they were converted into tourist information centres because they're beautiful old classic buildings and what have you, and an art gallery. And all of that was done without any cost to the government. So I'm proud of that outcome because everyone won. And then we sort of move forward. You're regretting now that you asked me this question.
No, not at all. This is where I was hoping that we would get to.
Well, the lesson that you learn through all of that is what you can do by through the planning process to shift value and then create outcomes that might otherwise, if you just strictly stuck to property boundaries and entitlements, then would not be possible. So then the next one after that would be Caroline Springs. That was a site, the 850 hectares had been on the market in various ways or shapes for probably 7 or 8 years, 10 years maybe. It was owned by the Gilbertson family since 1905, so it was all pre-GST, and used as a sort of a holding pen or holding property for animals that were brought down for meat processing. And so it was basically 850 hectares with a Corroy Creek running through the middle of it, and the rest of it was mostly weeds, saffron thistles, and dead flat rocks too. And I remember one of the comments, so this is when I was with Delphin. My job was to work on putting together the feasibility for a project that would run for 22 years. For a project that would preserve the GST free status of the land, put together a joint venture structure with others, not just me, but put together a joint venture structure that worked for all parties and could sustain the amount of capital infrastructure required to get the project running. So that project effectively set for Victoria sales records. We signed the deal in 1998 after working on it for 2 years. Late 1997. Started the project in January 1998, 44 degrees, excavating in rock. You got about, half a metre, was as much topsoil as you had. Then you hit fractured bluestone lava rock. And it was hard. And so we started excavation in January. First releases in 2 months later in March. People were living a promise. We effectively set the project for a 14-year, a 20-year lifespan, starting it in 1998, it was finished in 2010. So effectively a 12-year lifespan, pretty much half. Set sales record year on year, doing 600, average was about 680 sales per annum. Managed to deliver pricing that was on average double the original assumptions, because of the ability that Declan had to be able to craft urban design and product mix and hydraulic and project management focus in a way, and manage it in a way that was, you're able to create value from nothing, because that site had no natural attributes other than the Corroy Creek, and even that was heavily degraded and flowed infrequently, etc. So 8,700 and something dwellings later, 25,000 square metres of retail floor space, 25,000 square metres of office floor space, 5 schools, and supplementary learning and education infrastructure, plus an enduring sports precinct, which Collingwood Football Club bought into, so adult-sized ovals, co-location of facilities, so that all of the facilities there were far more advanced than what any individual school could afford to buy or build themselves. Co-shared, co-managed, etc. That's been an example project, I think, for won all the awards you can win for that type of project, and that's an example of how you are able to get the structure right, because essentially this was not a pay up front deal. This was a pay as you go deal. The owner, because of the pricing we achieved and the volumes we achieved, did better than they could possibly have imagined doing relative to the initial hurdles that we set. The company, obviously Declan, did much better than our best forecasts would have suggested, because of the focus. And that's where I learnt the value of urban design, focus, project management, and using every attribute of a site, particularly when you're doing something different with it rather than just leaving it fallow, to turn it into an advantage. And that created an address, and an address created a sense of place, which created a location which people wanted to be in. So that's another one. And then I'd move to probably the Footscray ammunition factory in Melbourne. Again, a 135-year-old facility for the production of bullets for the defence of the colony of Victoria. Interestingly enough, because it was that old. Lots of buildings that had to be, well, heritage classified, but lots of them heavily contaminated, some with explosives and all sorts of things. And a floodplain on the Maribyrnong River, which was also contaminated. So a whole piece of work again, environmental management again, converting getting a planning scheme in place, and this is a phone now, so if I'm losing a completely. What's that? So that was in a again, it was just one of those projects that was just interesting of itself, given what we did with the remediation work. Came there with an expectation the remediation work, or the budget that was being adopted for it, was in the tens of millions. I spent my time looking at ways to do it for less than that. We had actually managed to do it for less than 5, with all the compliance in place. So that's a straight benefit to the bottom line if you're able to do that. And that set the project up. So the product mix again got going, and we got the sort of momentum that you're looking for. Then going forward again, projects that in Lend-Lease, the Footscray site was a Lend-Lease project, so was the Maribyrnong site. But oddly enough, another one of those ironies, I'd set those up when I was with ADI, Australian Defence Industries, appointed the joint venture partner only to be on the other side of it as the proponent when I was with Lend-Lease, responsible for the business that was doing the project. So it's funny. Then I go forward. Again, really enjoyed my time at Lend-Lease because it broadened you across different sectors as well, because I was primarily residential at this stage, and this is back in the early 2000s. And like there are 4 or 5 other examples like Caroline Springs, but in Brisbane and in Sydney that had similar experiences. So this ability to understand the alchemy of what makes what's a project sing was something that has stood me in good stead over an extended period of time. Then moving forward to I was proud of the experience that I was able to or bring to, and the outcome that I was able to achieve with Lend-Lease Prime Life. That was a mess in the GFC, and a situation where I think I mentioned this in the last conversation, but the effort that we put in to ensure the business did not close down because of the obligations that you had to the people who were dependent on you. 2, the Lend-Lease's willingness, preparedness to do what it took to ensure that happened. I was very proud of that. Not only is it me, I mean, I was proud of it in terms of the company and its contribution. I was proud of the fact that we were able to find an ownership solution that enabled all of that to happen. I was proud that we were able to do that in a way that took the people, the employees, because there were 2,500 of them, with the management, because it had sort of floundered, had no direct leadership, had no hands-on focused on what are we going to do and how are we going to do it and where do we want to be. So I was proud that they were fully supportive of me in the role as MD, and proud of the fact that we're able to, and it still continues to be a contributor in the Lend-Lease family of companies. So managed to do the job, but it was exhausting and stressful. We staved off the banks and their behaviour in the GFC, and that was a huge learning experience for me in terms of you can't just sort of hope that things will get better by doing what you've always done. You've got to realise that the circumstances are what they are, and you've got to act. And the biggest mistake was to do nothing. There were no bad decisions. There were only absence of decisions. So you had to make decisions and get on with it, and it worked out okay. Then moving forward to Fraser's, I think probably two or three stand out. First one would be, I think, from the repositioning of Australand to ensure that it stopped doing some of the things that it was not competitive in, like domestic housing, getting itself out of that and focusing it on medium density housing, and that has proven to be a very strong strategic shift. Yes, there were casualties in that, but the benefits far outweighed the downsides. So that's more of a management decision and strategy direction. Allied to that was the restructure that we needed to do, and that's why I joined the company, to help restructure the deals that they were in that were going nowhere because they were pre-GFC deals, and the GFC had smashed them completely. So we did all of that work, and that positioned the company to trade extremely well over from 2012, 13, 14, while a takeover was hanging in the air. And I'm very proud of the fact that the team remained completely focused on the business at hand rather than worrying about what their futures would look like if a takeover we were bought by Stockland or someone like that. And there was Stocklands were the favoured buyer because they had 19.9% of us when Capital Land sold down half of their interest. So keeping a team of people focused. Excuse me.
Okay.
Rod Fehring. Good, thank you. Can I call you back? I'm sorry, I'm just on the phone. Okay, thank you. Bye. Yeah, grief, my birthday. One thing or another. So where was I?
Keeping people focused. Keeping people focused during your takeover or the talk of takeover.
And I was very proud of that because what happened was that when the momentum that we build up and then the market turned in our favour because we restructured projects, got the structures right, and then the market turned and we're effectively in a position where we got maximum benefit from the projects that we were in because we de-risked them and as a consequence from a variety of facets. And that gave rise to the sort of trading performance that then enabled Australand to find the right owner, and it didn't turn out to be Stockland. It turned out to be Fraser's. And what happened was that the momentum that we'd created flowed into Fraser's, and Fraser's with Central Park particularly and Putney in Sydney. The combination of those two projects, along with the portfolio of projects that we had in the residential space, plus the industrial business, plus the commercial assets that we had, meant that we started way outperforming anyone's expectations about what was possible. And that set up, and then I was fortunate enough to become CEO of that and benefited from that ride. So I'm proud of that. I'm proud also then of the putting, rather than just sort of being focused just on the things that I was known for. I think going back to my roots, putting the emphasis that we did on growing the industrial business, and then having being prepared to just to separate that from the remainder of the business and give it, if you like, a space to grow, so that the market could start to understand the scale of the runway that business had, rather than it being sort of a captive of little old Australia, with an international owner in place. It had scope to grow, and that's exactly what it's done. It's gone from 1.82 billion when it was in Australand to a 6.5 billion now, and 5-6 years later, and it'll hit 10 over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. Well, 4 years, I would have thought. So that I'm proud of that in terms of value creation. And the other thing, though, in coming in as the CEO replacing Bob, I put a high priority, a strategic priority, in getting the culture right in the organisation, because it was a culture that was a little bit siloed, and collaboration wasn't a strong suit, despite the fact that everyone said they wanted to work in a collaborative environment. It wasn't their strong suit, and what has transpired is that we've turned by a variety of means, managed to turn the culture into a very collaborative culture, which meant that working flexibly in COVID was really something that only sort of disrupted us for a couple of weeks. And if anything, it's hard to see how we'll go back to working in a more traditional ways that 6 or 7 years ago we were. So I'm very proud of that, and I'm proud of the performance, and I'm proud of the succession then that's been created for the next leadership teams for the industrial business and for the FPA business too, and because I think that puts those platforms in good hands and gives them longevity and gives them freedom to be able to benefit from the individuals that are now leading those businesses, to put their energy into them in a way that, after 5 or 6 years, doing it across the lot, then bringing it out and unleashing them with good culture and good owner in place, then I think that also is probably something I'm proud of from a strategic perspective. So I'll stop there. So you pick.
I've written down a whole bunch of questions here. The first one I want to touch on, which I think leads on from what you've just talked about. You made mention that you liked to, or you kept moving on every 5 years, and you felt that you were more valuable helping people become their best, or to do the best that they could. Was that a skill or an attribute that you intrinsically had, or was it something that you worked on over time to identify and find ways of helping people make that happen?
I think it was probably intrinsic, but I didn't understand it until I started being put in situations where I needed to think beyond what I could control and what I could do in a project-only situation. Sport teaches you a lot in that regard, particularly team sports. You realise that the individual contribution, is fantastic, and you've got to celebrate it on the one hand, but no team ever was successful because of one individual. Maybe Michael Jordan is the exception to that, but even he would admit that Scottie Pippen and people like that were instrumental in enabling him to be as good as he could be. So I think that's the art of it. I think there was an intrinsic or natural set of attributes that in terms of your personal style and how you relate to people. I think that a preparedness to make decisions, and difficult ones, is necessary in all of that. But on the same token, making sure that you spend the time to ensure that the decisions you are making are the right ones and for the right reasons, and that they're communicated well. And I think probably over a period of time, I've got better at putting more emphasis on communicating them well, because a good decision poorly communicated is no decision at all. So I think that's one. Well, that's how I think it's evolved. Put it that way.
All right, and then I had a question also about planning. And do you think it's easier going to a planning authority, which may be a local council or a state government? Is it easier when you go to them with a big project, with a big vision for a very large parcel of land, than, say, going through a standard planning process to get a permit for a whatever sized development, 14 units, 3 units? Do you get I hesitate to use the word easier run, but are they more collaborative, or do you still face the same kind of issues that a regular planning application might face?
I'd like to say no, but unfortunately yes, because sadly what happens in planning is the lowest common denominator dictates the process. And an application's an application. And unfortunately, when you've got, I recall a municipality that will remain nameless was receiving with a planning department of about 40 people, they were receiving on average per week 1,000 applications a week. And when you think about that and the processes that those individuals in local government are required to follow, as determined by state and federal governments and legislative frameworks and what have you, and local politics, etc., the likelihood that you're going to get any outcomes or any different treatment, whether you're applying for an extension to your pergola or you're applying for a 55,000 square metre office tower worth 400 million, Yes, there are processes to actually take those offline, but all of that means, in my experience, is that they're taken offline to get treated in the same way, just more complicated. The intensity, oh, this is a big project, this will be fantastic. So everyone wants to make their career out of what we did on Project X. And the complexity that we deal with now in development applications and development approvals processes compared to what it was 30 years ago is exponentially greater. And when you're dealing with that sort of complexity, and technology unfortunately hasn't helped a lot because it's made more questions possible to be answered. So the more questions you ask, the more the more complexity you engage in, and the politics remains the same, because ultimately development is not something that's desired. Generally speaking, if you go in Sydney and Melbourne, mostly, not totally, and Brisbane, pre-COVID, development's inevitable. The assumptions are politically it'll happen anyway. So why should we give anyone any attention over and above what would otherwise happen by due process? COVID comes along, suddenly there's a recognition that development's really actually an economic activity and it contributes to the economy. Oh, let's fast track, let's do this, let's do that. Well, the economic drivers were there before, it's just that they were masked in the assumption that it'll happen anyway. When you're confronted with a situation where people's livelihoods across the community, not just the benefits of a developer, for a developer or a builder, when they're in question, then suddenly a different urgency applies. So look, I think the intensity of focus and the time taken tends to be, relatively speaking, proportional to the quantum of the investment made. So if it's a $100,000 investment, you'll get that amount of attention. If it's a $500 million investment, you'll get that amount of attention. But exponentially, in proportion, it's still the same.
Yes, it'll be interesting to see what changes get made following these big announcements about big infrastructure projects, and whether I'm always curious whether they'll flow down to the smaller operator. Like the big projects get all the attention and maybe they get a few shortcuts along the way, but does it flow down to the smaller operator? We'll see. It's interesting.
I think it'll flow through supply chains, but is there, just because WestConnex gets completed or accelerated, or elements of it, does that mean that the next road closure, or road redevelopment in the northern beaches of Sydney gets addressed any quicker? No, it doesn't. It all just project by project, treated on their merits, one by one, and the same skepticism about the development dividend or the social benefit that's derived from these investments re-emerges, because everyone wants the activity, but they don't want it where they are. They don't want it to affect them.
Well, I'm glad you touched on that, because that was a question I also had for you, was this notion of resistance or stasis, which you touched on, around people not really wanting to change or not wanting change around them. How have you dealt with that in your experience?
Yeah, look, I'll go back to that Williamstown example, and it's been a good lesson. You've got to assume that it's going to be there, but you can't sort of treat it as what's the word? You can't treat that opposition as personally, or treat it as something that is, people going beyond their rights, notwithstanding how, elaborate some people choose to try and expand on the nature of their objection, and conspiracy theories and all sorts of things that get sort of fabricated for the purpose of what this might mean. Consultation is the key, and just being very upfront, transparent, authentic. By that I mean no spin, just present what you know. and present it in a way which is open and honest, and you've got to be well prepared in those circumstances, so that when the inevitable, oh, that's rubbish, I know this because I read an article on social media sometime about a particular species that has been threatened in this location. You say, well, it doesn't actually, it's not indigenous to this location, it's indigenous to an area 400 kilometres away. It's gotten here by nefarious means, blah, blah, blah. If you're across your stuff, you know your detail, then people respect that grudgingly. They will respect it. Won't necessarily change their overt position, but covertly they say, oh, okay, these blokes are actually know what they're doing. And that earns respect over a period of time. And the processes that are in place, that the legal processes and the development approval processes enable that to emerge over time. Where it gets difficult is where people just want to, for political reasons, use objection as a launching pad for a political career. And development's a wonderful way to do that, because no one listens to any facts in those circumstances. They're just interested in going along for the ride of it's us, not you, and all that sort of stuff. I get frustrated about that. I mean, take the St Mary's project in Sydney, out near Penrith, split between two municipalities, Penrith and Blacktown, New South Wales government, Commonwealth-owned land. What a recipe for disaster that was. It launched 4 political careers that I'm aware of, and took 13 years to get through the planning approval process. Sadly, I've been associated with one way or another for all of those 13 years. And that's why I get a little bit jaundiced about how politics and development play themselves out. And unfortunately, what that has is very, very, very nasty byproducts. And you see that play out with the formation of ICAC, and you see that play out with the behaviour of developers and brown paper bagging politicians, and politicians expecting brown paper bags from developers, or developers making political contributions and expecting favours. You know, we've been sort of now out of that space for 20 years and have never made political donations. And certainly the brown paper bag piece, that's just a criminal activity. But it's surprising that because of the stakes that are at play, people decide to behave that way as the only way to get through. And if that's how you choose to operate, well, it's certainly not a way that any organisation I've associated with has wanted to operate.
Well, I think we've moved from brown paper bags to now suitcases. That's how big the projects have got to. The carrying units have got much bigger.
Yeah.
What about when you find yourself in those challenging situations where you've got competing demands, you do have really difficult decisions to make? There's not going to be an easy outcome. Sometimes might be described as the least worst option, or just very tough decisions or difficult situations. How do you manage your emotions, or how do you approach those scenarios?
Well, I think a decision-making process is important, because you've got to distinguish what decision you're making. So sometimes a lot of the difficulty is actually created when you think you're answering or making a decision about do we or don't we invest in property X in order to overcome the difficulties that it's experiencing finding its market. Or, but in reality, what's involved is a sales team that's not performing. So, what decision are you making here? So, I think getting clear understanding of the nature of the issues that are involved, and what the realistic options are in order to achieve a solution. So I think a decision-making process that spends some time analysing, gathering facts and perspectives. So that's important. using a forum then for bringing that material in a coherent form to a group of people. I use investment committees for that to flesh out and understand what's being said and what the issues are and whether the solutions really do pass muster, and also to understand the consequences of any decision that you make as well. In the end, the decision rests with the CEO or me or the board, but you've got to be confident about the decision you're making, and but you can't avoid it. So the simple answer is you've got to make your decisions and get on with it. Yeah, there are downsides, but look, there are downsides. So accept them for what they are. Know why why that's the best course of action, and get on with it. So to a certain extent, I took a decision probably 15 or 20 years ago. I used to really get tied up emotionally about that. I took a decision that was just doing me no good, because the more decisions you have to make, you just can't live that way, because what you end up doing is not making any, and that's the worst thing you can do. So I take a view that you've got to make a call based on the best information available in the circumstance you find yourself in, and have an idea about where this decision takes you, and whether if that decision takes you somewhere you want to be, then do it.
Oh, good. You also touched on working on a 22-year feasibility for Caroline Springs. How do you go? I'm just sort of trying to wrap my head around how you would start on a 22-year feasibility. How do you approach that?
You have to build a big spreadsheet.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of cells.
Yeah, that's right. And oh, look, I mean, it's a good process. I enjoyed that process, to be honest. Everyone likes a spreadsheet. If you're in the property industry, I mean, everyone loves a spreadsheet. And it teaches you about the moving parts and the importance of what we use as measures and metrics to determine what a good investment looks like versus what a bad one is. The process also teaches you they only take you so far. If you think about in rising markets, there is always an element of intuitive knowledge, otherwise called gut feel, about what feels right and what assumptions, what things you assume are achievable. And that's something that you build up over time. You can't just sort of know that intuitively. Some people can, and good luck to them. So you know, it's just iterative. We did that 22-year. I remember there were 110 versions of it. From the first master version, then you start doing market analysis to populate what you think the pricing structure looks like. Then you do market analysis to understand what you think the product mix should look like. Then you do land analysis in order to be able to actually figure out, well, how much actual developable land have you got versus and make sure that's right, because if you've actually assumed that roads are going to be X wide and they're Y wide, then suddenly that's land that you don't have to sell, and you know they can, over a project of that scale, can cost you, you know, hundreds of millions. The cost base that you assume in terms of how many people you're going to take to run the project, what do you pay them, how do you reward them, all those sorts of things. How much borrowing you take on, where do you get it, and how much equity you're going to have to put in, whether that's actually going to drive the sort of returns that a landowner wants. The answer is never. They always want more than whatever you propose. Then they'll want it certain and locked in. It's fixed payments and all that sort of stuff. So you've got to manage all of that. Then you've got to transpose that into a business plan, transpose that into a budget, and then get on with it. Raise the capital too, of course, get the borrowing, and then the banks are always nervous about how much stock you've got on, what your major capital commitments are from a CapEx point of view, blah, 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 and just so no cash flow. But ultimately, when it's all said and done, you do a big feasibility like that in order to achieve one thing, a single row down the bottom that tells you what's your net cash flow look like. And then you spend all of your time managing that number as best you possibly can year on year.
Yeah, I find it challenging enough on a kind of 3-year project, like a 22, 23-year one.
The other thing about that, though, is it's not fixed.
That's right.
One of the disciplines that I think Delphin was brilliant at was basically saying, right, it's 20 years, it's 4 or 5-year projects, and you've got to break it down into that. So don't worry about the last 15 to 17 years of it. Focus on the first 5, and what you've got to do is beat the first 5. And then you pull that 5 years out, pull it apart, put it back together again, break that down to year by year. And by doing that, what you found is that your first 5 years was actually better than you thought it was. And so then that becomes the base on which you lift up the next. And then you find that the exponential that runs out the back of this, we got to a situation where, IRRs and all that sort of stuff didn't make any sense because they were infinite. So, I mean, if you get infinite return, well, that's obviously a good thing, but frankly, it's not very helpful in trying to judge what you should or shouldn't do year on year.
Yeah, it's good that you touched on cash flow, because I remember you saying when you took over, or you came in to restructure the retirement village or the retirement business, you realised that it had no cash flow, and you said, if you don't have any cash flow, you don't have a business. I wondered whether you had any ideas for maybe smaller developers on what they could do to generate cash flow in their businesses.
It depends on what type of business it is. Development businesses are notoriously bad at cash flow because they pay too much up front, and then they've got to borrow, and then they've got to generate. They've got to borrow until they actually start to generate income on project X, if you like. In those circumstances, sounds really trite, but from a project management point of view, just focus on getting to the point of revenue. And know how long it takes, because unless you can be confident about when revenue is going to be generated, all of the other decisions that you're making today about debt and your investment in cost base and number of people and all those sorts of things are completely dependent on when revenue is achieved, because all of your return on cost, return on yield on cost, IRR, etc., are all dependent on when you start to get revenue. Because if you can bring revenue forward because you're good at project managing and managing your cost base, how you procure, all those sorts of things, you're bringing that space forward. But that's for a one project company, for the want of a better term, where the principals are doing all of the work, and they'll take their pay out of they'll take their living expenses today, but they'll take their out of a project management fee, but they'll get the payoff when the project actually hits break even and better. And usually that's in the last 10 to 15% of the project. And so making that certain and sooner is a good idea because that's why you're doing it in the first place, presumably. For businesses that are able to generate cash flow from multiple sources, then not just development, then that's what I'm more familiar with. I mean, I'll do private projects, but that's private stuff. Where then it becomes all of the questions around diversification. What's the mix of how do you make money? You've got asset management fee streams, you've got development management fee streams, project management fee streams, you've got property management fee streams, facilities management fee streams, rent coming in that needs to exceed your cost base. Then you've got development as well. Then you've got ways to actually own and hold assets that don't cripple your balance sheet. That's what REITs are about. So that gives you the ability to be able to then invite in other capital, so you can release more of your own capital to be able to actually do other things and recycle capital on an ongoing basis. That's equity usually, without having to go to banks all of the time. So the all of the ingredients associated with putting together a diversified business need to take three things into how do you get quality of earnings up, which is usually your alpha earnings. How do you sustain beta earnings, which are your recurring earnings? And then how do you do that using a capital structure that delivers that is able to generate a cash flow that is bankable. You don't have to, by bankable, I don't mean banking with a bank, but banks are always a good test on whether it's bankable. And if it's bankable for a bank, well, it should be bankable for you, provided you've got the wherewithal to be able to sustain.
So have you always had a propensity for numbers, or was it something that you have refined or built upon over the decades?
It's probably learned be fine. Yeah, over a period of time. I was always good at statistics and the maths around statistics, and cash flow analysis and business analysis tends to be fairly allied to that. Whereas if you ask me to do calculus or something like that, I said, not really a strong suit. So I was better in the more pure types of maths, or applied maths, I should say, than the pure maths.
You just mentioned private projects. Have you done any personal stuff on the side, or has it always been the company stuff?
Oh, yeah, bits and pieces, but nothing to run. Well, only for personal interest as well. About 10 houses or something like that over time, about 10 properties, but they've been quite bespoke. Built a house for my mum, and that sort of stuff. But I've really not had a lot of time to do that sort of thing, to be honest, because it's probably that analogy about landscape gardeners. You go to a landscape gardener's place and it's usually a hovel. Because the landscape is because they do it for a living. They don't want to do it as well when they're home. Or carpenters, everything's broken down because they're fixing everyone else's problems, not their own.
Yeah, I was just curious about whether you like the sort of dabbling in a smaller project when you're working on big, massive projects, kind of like maybe jumbo jet pilots that build their own gliders or something like that, just because they like to.
Oh, no, I've not done it, but as I say, I haven't had a lot of time. I don't feel as though I've had a lot of time. Plus, I live a balanced life. I do put a lot of store on just managing your energy, and you've got to do that because you can't sustain a focused mindset unless you're healthy and well exercised and well rested. And you also can't do all of that if you've got a lot of stress and family difficulties at home. So I'm blessed by having a partner. Karen and I have been together for 40 years, married next year in May, and another 5 or 6 years on top of that. So we've been together for a long time, and that aspect of your life when it's so stable, and it's a significant ingredient in how you're able to do what you do.
Yeah, we touched on that last time. You mentioned that you had a lot of energy. I asked you if that was something that you'd worked on. You touched on exercising. You've just mentioned diet now. I mean, it's something you obviously put some focus into. Is that all it is? Just diet and a bit of exercise? Is there anything else?
I think keeping your mind fresh too, in terms of reading, just making sure the breadth of what you read, and also just recognizing that I've always been a person. I've always worked flexibly one way or another. I might actually spent a lot of time in an office, but I've always worked flexibly. If my mind is one when it's on, I just sometimes think, this is fantastic because everything flows. And other times, everyone's like this, but anything I do today is just a mess. Everything's wrong. And so in those circumstances, I just go home and just do something else, because whatever I did that day I'd have to do it again tomorrow anyway. And anyone who relied on what I did that day would inevitably have been led up the garden path. So I just try and avoid doing that when I'm in that frame of mind.
Well, you're married. You probably learned that early on during your marriage, Rod. Always, whatever you do, it's going to be wrong.
Yeah. Oh, well, no. I've learned the two words that make for a happy marriage.
Yes, dear.
Yes, dear. That's right.
You're right.
I've learned to my significant cost that if I don't say "you're right" often enough, I'm in trouble, because apparently I say it, I'm right, too often, and that never augurs well. So
I asked you last time what you would do if you had a spare hour to do something that you really love doing. You mentioned going for a bike ride. What's the worst thing I could get you to spend an hour doing?
Just a sec.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. It's my daughter. Sorry.
No,
Worst thing. The worst thing I could spend an hour doing. Yeah, milking cows.
from back in your early days.
Not something I'd like to do a lot of. Oh, no, that's not true. I don't mind doing that. I don't get much chance anymore. But yeah, no, not something I think about. If I don't want to do it, I don't do it usually. Yeah, I'm not very handy. I don't like doing handy stuff because what's something that should be simple, I just stuff up, and I find that frustrating. So, yeah, I'm not a handy person.
No, that's okay. I wanted to touch on getting close to the end of our time. It's gone quickly as usual. You mentioned last time that you were involved with working on affordable housing.
Mm-hmm.
What's your interest in affordable housing? What does it mean to you? How can developers or how can people solve the problem? Can it be solved?
Well, I think it can. Look. The reason is I've always had my attitude towards housing is it's a fundamental need, a necessity. Safe, secure housing is a building block around which lives get built. When it's not available, when it's not part of your life experience, the damage that can do in terms of fragmented families, in terms of impermanence, in terms of undermining educational experience, undermining your individual sense of self-confidence, the undermining the fundamentals of maintaining relationships, etc., etc. All of that gets impacted on, influenced by the security and quality of the housing environment that you find yourself in. And so, given that it's a necessity, I think when you look at the Australian circumstance, where for 70 years, longer in fact, home ownership has been the prime objective of all policy frameworks that Australia has promulgated for since Federation and before. That is increasingly over recent times, particularly since interest rates were deregulated, and in the environment we've got now, where interest rates are falling. When I've looked at all of the metrics that influence the affordability of housing, it's interest rates that is the one that's correlated. Lots of other things influence employment, and demographics, immigration, all those sorts of things. But if interest rates are low, really low, then that drives housing demand. What it does also, unfortunately, is it capitalises a lot of the differential between what the interest rates are and what an individual's sense of what capital's worth to them. So they borrow more, and that gets capitalised into the value of property, and as a consequence, housing prices go up. So in those circumstances, when house prices, as we experienced over the post-GFC period, rise at a rate that exceeds the capacity of individuals to save a deposit, whether it be 5, 10 or whatever a bank requires, then in those circumstances, what are the choices available? And in circumstances where individuals who have jobs and who are working and are able to save, what if you don't? What if you have an accident? What if you have a stroke? What if you have all sorts of things that happen to people out of their control, that cause them to be either marginalised in the employment market, marginalised in terms of participation in mainstream economic activity. In those circumstances, how as a community do we deal with those people and who are affected that way? And in my mind, that's part of the social obligation that people who create housing should also be mindful of, that they also have an obligation to ensure that the housing we create is responsive to needs. And these are needs that exist, whether you be a disability, a mental disability, and what have you. Yes, governments play a role there and have to play a role, because mainstream markets are not going to deal with meet those needs in a conventional way. So the interest that I have is in exploring ways that public and private relationships can find solutions to meet those needs that would otherwise not be met. And if they're not met, then what that translates to is, women with children living in cars, homelessness, drug, all that stuff that runs from disadvantage. All that stuff is avoidable, or should be avoidable, in a wealthy, developed economy. And I think it is an obligation on people who participate in the industry to look at ways to help find solutions for meeting needs. And it's not just a need, because they're all quite different, and so different solutions for different purposes in different locations. That to me is another whole raft of interesting and important work that needs to be done to find ways to respond to circumstances and needs that the mainstream is not dealing with. And governments have got a clear role in that, but clearly the private sector does too, and that's why.
Well, ironically, in the last day or so, the Victorian government's announced a big investment program into social housing, which will be interesting to see how that rolls out.
Yep, I think that's fantastic. I think it's good, but that can't be it for the next 20 years. Victoria's grown. When you look at the proportion of social or public housing that's being provided to meet the needs of people who fall out of a housing market that is growing, it's necessary that it grows. So the job now, I think, is even more important to be able to say, all right, well, if that's possible now, that's good for the short term, but and it's a great legacy, but you've got to build off that to make it sustained over a period of time. Because I think we're building about less than 2% of new housing starts are public housing starts, less than 2%. And that's been static and declining for the last 20 years. So, I think there is that means that there are all sorts of people who are simply falling out of the whole system. And we're seeing the rise of homelessness, we're seeing the rise of housing stress, and we're seeing unfortunate consequences that flow from that in the form of mental health and at its worst, suicide.
One final question, and it's a very broad one, I understand, but what's your view on the future of I'll say the Australian housing market? You can break it down or give me your view on that, but over the sort of medium to longer term, where do you think we're headed housing-wise across the country?
I think post-COVID, there's a bump or two ahead for the next 2 years, but interest rates are so low now that I think that could well pave the way through. I think the answer to the question really rests more around the performance of the economy and how borders open up, interstate and internationally, and whether Australia reconnects with the world, as it must, given that we're a small trading nation with an open economy, or it doesn't to the degree necessary. And I think that's why risks around to the housing market are as much about risks about us narrowing our view about the world we live in, rather than keeping it broad.
Very good.
So I'm optimistic about the housing market long term. Medium term, still optimistic. Short term, I think we've got some bumps ahead.
Yeah, I tend to think we're a growth country, and the governments have taken on a lot of debt over the last couple of years, actually. And the fastest way to pay that off is to bring in or grow the tax base, and the quickest way to do that is bring in taxpayers. So I think they're going to be looking to bring in more people, and they're going to need somewhere to live.
And we've got an ageing workforce. And the whole immigration debate is not about, should we or shouldn't we? The average age of our employees is 37 years old. And as a consequence of COVID, it will go to 38 and possibly 39. It has to be kept below 35. So where does that come from? Either extend the working age and so postpone retirement and what have you for another 5 years. I'm at the back end of the baby boomers, so I keep chasing that line. I think there'll be some of that, unfortunately. But also you've got to grow the base. And, that's a good idea, but birth rates per female are at world lows in the scheme of things, and not likely to change. And as a consequence, then what's the solution? There's only one other solution. Or you could take the Dick Smith view and just implode, and everything will be fine. We'll be able to pay for welfare and everything else off the back of something. I'm not sure what.
I think it's always easier for people who have wealth or means to proselytise those kind of outcomes. It's a bit different when you need jobs and need income.
Yep, funny thing that.
All right, Rod, it's been so awesome talking with you again. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and expand on some of those topics. I really appreciate your time, and I wish you well we've established that it's not retirement. So in your post CEO days, whatever they bring.
Very good. Okay. Thanks very much, Justin.
See you later, Rod. Thanks again. Bye.
You've been listening to the Property Developer Podcast. Tune in next time for more tips, ideas and inspiration to take your developing to the next level. For more developing love, make sure to visit propertydeveloperpodcast.com.